From the Penn Institute for Urban Research and the Volcker Alliance, this is Special Briefing. I'm Bill Glaskell. Susan Wachter is off today, and so I'm here today with Leslie Richards, Director of the Transportation Initiative at Penn and former Pennsylvania Transportation Secretary and SEPTA CEO. Hi, Leslie.
Hi, how you doing, Bill? Happy to
I'm
be here for this conversation.
I'm doing fine, and you're going to be helping drive this train through the day. And Leslie is with us today because our topic is transportation. And we have a really sharp panel of experts to deal with the here and now. And with the Iran war and oil prices, there's plenty to discuss. And then there's the future, including a huge surface transportation bill facing Congress come fall. So, welcome to you all. But before we get down to work, first, this brief message. Special briefings are made possible by funding from the Travelers Institute, the Volcker Alliance, and members of the Penn IUR Advisory Board. We're coming to you on the Penn IUR and Volcker Alliance websites and also on the Special Briefing podcast and Penn IUR YouTube channel. We're everywhere. And we've taken your questions in advance, and we'll be sure to get to them in a few minutes, and they're good ones. So let's begin with a brief intro. As I mentioned a moment ago, the transportation sector is at a crossroads, or maybe it's a five-way intersection. We have the war, the jump in gasoline and diesel and jet fuel prices, and their impact on inflation, consumer spending, and the global economy. And then we have longer-term issues like the massive surface transportation reauthorization bill up for renewal in Congress, plus the administration's stop-and-go funding of big projects, and several federal initiatives to speed construction of bridges and other badly needed infrastructure. And that's just for starters. We may not get to it all in this hour, but we're sure going to try. To review the challenges ahead, we'll kick off with Naomi Rennick, former senior advisor at New York's Metropolitan Transportation Authority. For the big picture on the transportation sector, we'll get the latest from Baye Larsen, vice president and senior credit officer at Moody's. There they are up on your screen. And counties are responsible for 45% of America's road miles. And for the lowdown on that, I didn't know that until I looked it up. For the lowdown on that and more, please welcome Eryn Hurley, Chief Government Affairs Officer at the National Association of Counties, or NACO. To get those roads fixed, rebuilt, put back in good shape, we need people to construct them. And for that view and some news on speedier bridge projects, I hope we'll bring in Lauren Shapter, Vice President of Legislative Affairs at the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. And finally, for his unique perspective on the sector, we'll hear from the Dean of Transportation Analysts, my old friend Bob Poole, the Reason Foundation's Director of Transportation Policy. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to the audience. And so, Naomi, why don't you start us off with the big picture view from New York?
Thanks very much and for having me. And when I saw the title of this panel, I was scratching my head a little bit because federalism has taken on a new meaning in the last few years. And I'm absolutely not an academic, but I did go back to some textbook definitions where we see that the discussion of federalism and new federalism is focused on which level of government makes decisions related to public goods. And that's how public sector resources and responsibilities are divided among levels of government, including taxing and spending, regulatory powers, policy, and so forth. And traditionally, there was a common understanding of what improved mobility is really a public good. So anything that goes into transportation, operational safety, infrastructure and good transition, faster movement of all vehicles, reduced pollution from the transportation sector. And federal funding has been provided based on this very basic concept that these things are good for society. And over the years, some people want more decision making at the state and local levels. Others want more centralized decision making and so forth. And I didn't think I would be quoting Nixon, but here we are. Nixon formally introduced new federalism, calling for a time in which power, funds, and responsibility flow from Washington to the states and to the people as a way to offer more money and less interference and, quote, a better way of solving problems. But now we're in this era where federalism also includes policymaking by executive order and less formal means of communication that's available to all of us. Which brings me to some transportation issues: congestion pricing, bus and bike lanes, fare-free buses, MWBE programs, and other policies and decisions that traditionally have been made at the local level. And I've been involved in several iterations of congestion relief in New York City going back more than a decade. And the current congestion relief program is a huge success and a model for other cities. It was implemented per New York State law, and the current program's reducing travel times for drivers, for emergency vehicles, for buses and taxis, making the streets safer for all users, and improving air quality while also raising money for transit infrastructure. So here we have an innovative, locally driven approach to providing a traditional public good. But there was tremendous federal involvement and interest despite adherence to existing federal laws. The courts have consistently upheld the program, but it's an example of this new version of federalism. Also, bus and bike lanes and fare-free buses are areas where there's new federal interest in local decisions about roadway use. And some states have preemptively moved away from their own programs intended to grow businesses owned by historically disadvantaged groups. This is one aspect of this new vamped federalism in its latest form. But it's important to note that while federal funding is being diverted from bike ped, EV, and other clean transportation projects toward the administration's more road-centric priorities, non-discretionary transportation funding largely continues to flow, and localities continue to make their own decisions on how they spend that money within the parameters of the existing programs. Land use is another area where decisions continue to be made at the local level. And this is critical since the integration of transportation and land use speak directly to affordability. Housing near transit and in areas with street level retail, sidewalks, bike lanes, traffic calming, and so forth allow people to be less car reliant, which saves money, particularly in this current environment, which we'll be hearing about a little bit later. So for all levels of government, policies and funding programs that encourage transit, active transportation, and denser land use are impactful to affordability, especially when they're paired with what now really must be locally driven affordable housing policies. So this revamped version of federalism was, I think, initially jarring to many of us, but now it's a factor in decision making regarding the policies and projects that states and localities prioritize, and also in when they go to court. So that's what I've got on the big picture, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Well, thank you, Naomi. We're gonna shift gears a little right now and go to Baye Larsen to talk about the big picture. But before you mentioned, Naomi, about the success of congestion pricing. I live about an hour and a half from Boston, and I would love to see it in the Boston area, given the horrible traffic that exists all day long. But given the local drivers' love of entropy, and extreme entropy, I'm a little bit dubious. But let's hope for it. Let's get the word from Moody's, and also, how is transportation congestion pricing affecting MTA's credit? Because I know you follow the MTA.
Sure. Yes. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, I should set the stage maybe and say that our outlooks for most of our infrastructure sectors in 2026 are all stable. So that's looking at our toll roads, our transit, airports, water and sewer. Interestingly, two exceptions we have in our port sector. Our outlook is negative, and that's largely due to some of the uncertainty and influences around tariffs. And then public power is actually positive because of increased demand there. But with the preponderance of the stable outlooks we have, I think that shows that even in the midst of the turmoil and the changing federal, state, local funding relationships, our transportation issuers do have tremendous flexibility and independence that stabilizes their credit profiles. But I think, connecting to Naomi's point, they're going to have to make some difficult choices. They're going to have to probably reprioritize some of those projects. If federal funding is moving from one place to another, are they going to backfill that or not? And it probably depends on the regional importance of that particular project. So maybe more broadly, some of the areas that we're particularly focused on this year, right now and more recently, we've definitely been watching gas prices to see how issuers respond. We have some states that are already exploring gas tax holidays, which would reduce a key funding source for a lot of highway and transit projects. And over the long run, that can increase costs for some systems, particularly, Bill, you mentioned it before, transit systems that are still running diesel trains or buses, you can quickly start to see those operating costs go up. Another area that we're looking at, I think, is really just the speed of change, and cases where a rapid change in access to federal funds has caught folks by surprise. And that less predictable funding freeze is typically harder to respond to than the more gradual transitions we might see elsewhere. So you've got, Gateway and Second Avenue Subway and CTA filing a lawsuit. Those are all freezes and surprises in some cases that can impact project delivery and possibly issuer liquidity and debt levels, depending on how they choose to respond to that. And then I think kind of the big issue that maybe a lot of us are focused on this year is the surface transportation reauthorization. So there, we're really focused on our states, our state DOTs. We have Garvey bonds that we rate, which depend directly on those federal grants to repay the debt service. And then we have most transit systems, of course, that are reliant on those grants for both their capital and their operating aid. And I think with reauthorization, the first question, of course, is when. History suggests that there will be multiple short-term extensions, and we expect to see that again this year. We've got midterms coming up, growing political polarization, sensitivities around the federal deficit. So this probably won't be quick. The next question is really how much. This authorization is coming on the heels of IIJA, which was a big increase in dollars, but was diluted by higher inflation, some labor force shortages, policy shifts after the administration change. So we have issuers still dealing with historic levels of capital need. And at the same time, this ongoing highway trust fund gap. If oil prices are still a headline, it's unlikely we'll see a gas tax increase. Other proposals for new revenues like electric vehicle registration fee on a national basis kind of seem like a stretch, certainly not big enough to fill the gap. If the federal government's going to consider a reduction in highway and transit grants, they'd need to cut those by about 40% and 72% respectively, which would be a big number to hit. So then your last option is we're back to the general fund transfers and some of our concerns about the growing federal deficit. All of that said, highways and transit are still essential, and there is a core set of projects that has national importance. We generally expect funding for those programs to be stable. If funding levels did drop, we would be taking a look at our Garvey bonds, which again rely on those federal grants directly. Most of them do have very high debt service coverage and a high degree of state support. In fact, a lot of those ratings are more closely tied to their state's credit quality rather than the flow of federal funds. But interestingly, another risk in this particular year is if reauthorization is coinciding with another federal shutdown. There at the same time, we have seen that happen before. I think it was maybe in 2012, and that would potentially increase the chance of a temporary grant disruption. We, in the past, have not seen too much disruption on the highway side. Transit has a mixed history, so we'd be keeping our eye on that. And I think another interesting question with reauthorization this year is how will the funding be structured? And what is that split between formula funding and discretionary grants going to be? The feds seem pretty open to giving states more flexibility with their formula funding, especially if it means getting projects done faster. But on the other hand, I think counties and local governments prefer those discretionary grants because they tend to have more direct access to some of those for their local projects. We, of course, I'm a transit analyst, also have my eye on those projects. Will transit get deprioritized or shifted out of the Highway Trust Fund? If they become more dependent on general fund transfers, though, that could increase the year-to-year uncertainty. So I think we're going to learn a lot this year about the federal government's planned role in infrastructure investment and how is this new federalism going to shape up going forward? Which level of government is going to take charge of what funding or of what type of project? And it may be that local governments just have to shift some focus and funding. But if there is an overall decline in support, I think we'll see that necessity is the mother of innovation. And hopefully we'll see more new funding structures like congestion pricing, more multi-state partnerships like the Gateway Project, states stepping up with new funding sources for their transit systems. But in the absence of innovation, then we would expect to see more borrowing by states and local governments, or risk a rise in deferred maintenance.
Well, thanks so much. I'm going to turn the mic over to Leslie to introduce Eryn, but I hope we can return to the question of whether mass transit will be deprioritized, and Leslie, get your thoughts on that, because you've been right in the middle of it, SEPTA. But anyway, over to you, Leslie.
Sure. No, absolutely. And thanks, Baye. Covered a lot of ground there and a lot of mention of what we are eagerly awaiting to find those decisions. But you also mentioned states versus local. And so it's wonderful. You set up Eryn beautifully. In addition to being PennDOT Secretary and General Manager of SEPTA, I've also been a county commissioner. So I really am interested, Eryn, in all the work that you do, and I understand the challenges that counties have looking at their projects. So Eryn, please fill us in on how the National Association of Counties is thinking about the next few months.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Leslie, for the introduction. Just to kind of give 2-second background of what NACO is. So we represent the nation's 3,069 county government. So that's parishes in Louisiana as well as boroughs in Alaska. So just want to kind of, provide that background for how I'm going to be talking about surface transportation and what our priorities are. So in terms of, before we get to some of NACO's priorities and kind of the implementation of IIJA and what that's actually looked like for counties, I wanted to really set the stage of why counties actually have a stake in this conversation, right? I think it's sometimes a common misconception that counties don't or aren't major players in this space. But in reality, counties are actually the single largest owner and operator of local infrastructure in the country. So I'm just going to throw out some numbers to give you a general idea of what I'm actually talking about. So as Bill mentioned earlier, counties actually own and maintain 44% of the nation's roads. So that comes out to 1.6 million of roadway miles. In terms of bridges, we also own 38% of the nation's bridges. So that's over 225,000 nationwide, which includes nearly 2/3 of all off-system bridges. And then when it comes to aviation, we also play a major role there. So counties, overall, we either own or support roughly 34% of the nation's airports too. So considerable role there as well. And then finally, when we're actually, talking about investment or financial support, counties, we invest $146 billion annually in actually building and operating physical infrastructure as well as public works, and then specifically $60 billion in transportation. So that's a really large picture of what counties actually do when it comes to all types of infrastructure. But even beyond what I laid out, counties play a significant role in dams, ports, water, sewer, and more. But I'll stop there. I think when we're talking about the county role, though, too, we also have to talk a little bit about what the current challenges are, right? And Naomi and Baye have definitely pointed this out, and what those challenges are and how they're being talked about in the context of the next surface transportation reauthorization package. So throughout the country, many county-owned roads and bridges are beyond their useful list and require repair. And I will note that isn't lack of trying. It becomes more of the funding access issue, which I'll touch on later. And then again, as Naomi and Baye has said, and it's becoming a trend of this conversation, is that we know the cost of infrastructure has gone up, whether that's due to gas or the cost of actual products for these projects. And ultimately, as part of that too, is issues with permitting reform, what the current environmental review process actually looks like. So I wanted to lay that all out to now kind of go through what NACO has taken away from implementation of the IIJA. So the bigger bipartisan infrastructure law package that of course expires at the end of this September, and what that actually really panned out to from a county or local government perspective. So despite our major investments in infrastructure, again, I mentioned the over $140 billion annually, we receive a fraction of federal investment to keep pace with what we need and actually can provide to our residents that are oftentimes actually mandated by the federal government or the states as well too. So that gap is really what NACO has been pushing for in terms of our advocacy. So let's kind of do a more laser focus in terms of the IIJA. So our major concern in terms of, maybe what didn't necessarily work as well, although IIJA was the largest investment that we saw in our nation's infrastructure, and NACO applauds that package absolutely and supported the passage of it. The biggest issue here is that federal funding really didn't get to the county level. So despite the county's ownership and infrastructure, what we actually saw, and this is research and data that NACO actually did, is that counties and other local governments received on average 14% of federal formula transportation dollars. And beyond that, when we're looking at the IIJA, there are only two main federal transportation formula projects that have sub-allocation requirements. So meaning that states are legally required to make funds available for those local projects. So again, out of all of these different formula funds, it's only two that counties actually are able to receive that funding. Another area that we really identified under the IIJA where we saw gaps is when we're talking about rural planning and thinking about rural counties in this space. So urban and suburban areas are covered by metropolitan planning organizations, which ultimately help local governments access, plan, and implement those sub-allocated funds. But rural areas are not required to have planning organizations, or they don't have the support to actually stand up something similar, So this really does, what we saw, creates a profound disparity. So the counties that sometimes have the greatest infrastructure needs, or the least fiscal capacity, have the least institutional support to access federal dollars. And this is really significant because when we're looking at a nationwide perspective, 70% of the nation's counties are actually rural. So that is a huge, huge amount of counties when we're talking about inadequate access to these federal dollars for infrastructure that is needed. And then the final, not necessarily a concern with IIJA, but something that I think is helpful to bring to this conversation is around local revenue. So when we're talking about counties, there are actually 42 states that impose property tax limitations on counties. That includes rate caps, levy limits, and asset restrictions. So what this means is that counties have a very limited ability to actually raise our own revenue to invest in infrastructure that we already own, or in new infrastructure that we ultimately need. And this is also, you have to take into account, this revenue is also used to provide, again, those mandated services that counties are required to provide, anything from public health, public safety, law enforcement, parks and rec, you name it, that we are required to provide to our residents. So it becomes almost a competition of how are you going to fund all of these competing priorities that are all at the same time extremely critical for our residents and that our residents depend upon and also need. And this could be a whole other conversation, but we've also seen a trend across the country as well too, of states looking to actually fully eliminate property tax. And so how that would actually end up panning out and how consequential and detrimental it would be to counties, not in just the infrastructure space, but also across the board. So then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about just the Basics Act. that NACO's been working on. And so this Basics Act, in the long form, it's the Bridges and Safety Infrastructure for Community Success Act, or the Basics Act. This bill came about, it's a bipartisan marker bill that was introduced by Congresswoman McDonald Rivet and Congressman Bob Bresnahan. And ultimately, it was a culmination of some of the areas or the gaps that we saw under IIJA that we wanted to ultimately address. So in terms of some of the priorities that NACO was asking, the Hill, USDOT, and how we ended up coming up with this bill is some of these key priorities. So first, what the Basics Act would do is that it would increase access to formula funding for local governments that would actually grow the share of sub-allocated dollars for locally selected projects. So this would directly address that major concern of the less than 15% of formula funding reaching local governments. The other area that we really focused on was to reshape the Bridge Formula program by adding a provision that 25% of Bridge Formula program funding must be suballocated. So again, that would guarantee a direct share flows to locally selected bridge projects. And then the final piece that I'll highlight before turning it back over to Leslie and Bill is that it would also address those concerns around that rural planning gap that I mentioned earlier. So it would provide dedicated funding for rural and regional transportation planning organizations that would, again, directly address that disparity and provide the tools needed for rural counties to be on a level playing field when we're talking about access to federal funds. There are other pieces in there too around strengthening the intergovernmental coordination between federal, states, and locals, permit streamlining, funding for road safety, and more. But again, kind of just to end it there, ultimately what we're going to see with the surface transportation package is how it's really going to pan out in terms of federal funding, how it's going to be allocated to states and locals, and how we can work in coordination with one another. So Leslie, Bill, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Eryn. That was really good background as well. I'm always amazed that, and I appreciate you emphasizing the rural needs, but I'm always amazed that you have to represent rural counties as well as, counties like Harris County that are bigger than many states, right? Yeah, very interesting. And so, Bill, pass it back to you.
You're tuned into special briefing from Penn IUR and the Volcker Alliance. Thanks again to the Travelers Institute, the Volcker Alliance, and members of the Penn IUR Advisory Board for your generous support. And don't forget, you can follow today's episode and all of our other special briefings on our websites, the Special Briefing Podcast and the Penn IUR YouTube channel. And now, Leslie, why don't you introduce our next guest?
Sure. I'm pleased to welcome Lauren Schapker from ARTBA. And let's hear how are our builders feeling about what's going on right now.
Thanks, Leslie. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today. So just a little background on who ARTBA is. So we represent all facets of the transportation design and construction industry. So everyone from the planners and designers on the front end of a project, all the way through the contractors, equipment manufacturers, material suppliers, and even local and state transportation officials who are tasked with maintaining these assets. So for us, we are laser focused on finding a way to get another surface transportation reauthorization bill done on time that continues this robust trajectory of investment that we saw over the last 4.5 years. Because, despite the pandemic, inflation, rising prices, we really have seen us starting to chip away at that backlog of deferred maintenance. We're seeing some of those major projects like the Brent Spence Bridge that have been on the books for decades finally get that green light to move forward. But we know there is still so much work to be done. So I thought I would start by just highlighting a few facts and figures that kind of show what we've achieved with the IIJA. We're almost 4.5 years in, and there have been nearly 120,000 highway and transit projects in every U.S. county that have received support from this law. So pretty much anywhere you go, you can point to something that has seen the impact from the IIJA. These dedicated investments are supporting 34% more bridge projects than we saw over the last reauthorization period. That's due to that new bridge formula program that was created in the law, as well as those big discretionary grant programs that are supporting, like I said, some of those major bridge projects that communities and states have been waiting on for decades. We are also seeing dedicated improvements to freight mobility. 9 of the top freight bottlenecks in the country are seeing IIJA supported funding to try to relieve constraints around these bottlenecks and keep freight networks moving efficiently across the country. And what I think is most notable is that highway, bridge, and street contractor employment is up 41,000 since the IIJA was signed into law. There was a lot of concerns that the industry would not be able to rise up and meet the levels of investment for all of these projects, but they have hired workers, and those workers are, working on projects. When we hear that inflation ate up everything that was increased investment, we always like to point to this number because our members are not hiring employees, they're not buying equipment if there's not actual increases in work being done. So we're really glad to see that happening. As we look ahead to the September 30th deadline, I also wanted to emphasize that those IIJA dollars do not stop on September 30th. They are going to be working through that construction pipeline over the next several years. After the IIJA was signed, we commissioned a study through IHS Markit that estimates about 40% of the IIJA spend out is going to be occurring after September 30th of this year. So that construction work is going to improve and continue. That's particularly relevant when it comes to bridge programs. Unlike those core highway programs in the IIJA, which have to be projects committed on an annual basis, states had the full 4 years to commit those bridge formula funds. So we're seeing, while many states have already committed a lot of those bridge formula funds, there are a lot of states that have only committed 30% so far. So we talk a little bit about federalism today, and that each state gets to kind of choose their own adventure when it comes to how they pick projects. So we're going to continue to see some states invested early on bridges. Others are going to be working on their bridge projects over the next several years. But in either case, we are seeing real improvements when it comes to lowering that number of structurally deficient bridges across the country. When the IIJA was signed into law, there were about 43,000 structurally deficient bridges. That number is down to 41,000, and we hope to see that downward trajectory continue as we continue the IIJA work, and then hopefully a new reauthorization bill signed into law, hopefully later this year. There are certainly headwinds, in any election year of getting major legislation done, but I do know that the House and Senate are working in a real bipartisan way to advance legislation this year, which is encouraging. I think, like Baye noted, we expect action in the House by this spring. The Senate is going to have a little bit of a later timeline as they're still emphasizing permitting reform, but because we've touched on transit a bit today, I did also want to note that if there are any proposed transit cuts, it's not going to make it through the Senate. The Senate needs 60 votes. They need Democrats. So any proposals like that are not going to make it across the finish line. I did think it was interesting a few weeks ago, the administration did float removing the transit account from the Highway Trust Fund. And it was the Republican chairman of the House committee who came out and publicly said that's a non-starter. So there's real support by getting something done in a bipartisan way, which means supporting transit programs as well. So a lot of interesting political dynamics this year with the election, gas prices, debates over the size of the bill, but we continue to be optimistic that there is plenty of time for Congress to get this done if they want to. And I know ARPA and its members will be advocating for that throughout the rest of the year. So again, appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I know it's always good to hear the perspective of those who are actually in there designing and building. And I have been involved with ARPA for many years, so really appreciate all of your work. And now for our final speaker today, Bob Poole from the Reason Foundations. And Bob, we've heard a few times some issues coming up, such as P3s and multi-jurisdictional projects and what lies ahead. So interested to hear from you as well as your thoughts on those topics. Bob?
My message is a little bit different this morning, and that is that the Highway Trust Fund is on its last legs. You're not expected to hear that, didn't expect to hear that, but my text for this is a report that came out earlier this month from the Eno Center for Transportation by two people that I know, called The Last Exit. And it basically systematically goes through to look at what's would be needed to deal with the situation in a business as usual situation. Congress they contend, cannot continue indefinitely bailing out the Highway Trust Fund with borrowed money. And this will absolutely cease by 2032, which is when Social Security is expected to be declared insolvent. That's a major earthquake. And so they go through in this report, which I take very seriously, that look at all the alternatives. Doubling federal fuel taxes would be one way to try to deal with the Highway Trust Fund. That has very low political likelihood, at least at this point. Cutting the spending to be consistent with the level of user tax revenues is also going to be a really, really hard thing to do. And most people think it's not likely. A federal registration fee, they look at a number of other alternatives, one of which would be a federal registration fee. Look administratively and legally, that looks difficult. Also, it's really a state function. So the concluding chapter in this big report says we really should look at the alternative of devolution of if the Highway Trust Fund cannot really survive past the date of Social Security insolvency, shouldn't we start thinking about what alternatives is available? And devolution, it turns out, it would mean you'd stop reauthorizing the Highway Trust Fund, pay off the existing advance commitments that are there, and then devolve the revenue and spending authority to the states and states for highways and localities for transit. That sounds very radical, but when in the time period we're talking about, when Social Security will go insolvent, within the lifetime of a 5-year reauthorization that would happen late this year, I think that's realistic. Devolution, in fact, was widely considered in the 1990s. It included Harvard scholars, a former head of OMB. There was a bill in Congress called the Mack-Kasich bill, which would have done this, devolved the highway and transit funding to this in 1996. You can look it up. The Republican Governors Association supported it then. I served on the California Commission on Transportation Investments in 95, 96, and it, including me, but you supported devolution of this, 20 years ago. So I think with the likely chaos coming in 2032 when Social Security is officially insolvent, it's prudent to begin thinking seriously of what we can do. And I think this report does suggest a possible alternative to certainly at least to think about would be devolution of the program.
Well, that's a very provocative way to start this out. And so why don't I kick off the questions? If the Highway Trust Fund is running out of cash and the funding hasn't been changed since Reagan. Am I right about that, Bob? That's
correct.
Right. So and inflation on top of it, and electric cars taking money away from gas tax revenues. It is a very unstable situation. So as an alternative funding source, I think Leslie asked why P3s haven't taken off in this country, and also what the future is for multi-state or multi-jurisdictional type projects like what the Port Authority does in New York or some other multi-state authorities are doing.
I think P3s would play a much bigger role if the federal government liberalized tolling. In other words, for example, the whole interstate highway system needs to be rebuilt and modernized. And probably the most feasible way to do that, given all these other factors, is to allow tolling as the primary funding and financing source for the interstate rebuild. And then you have the potential, a lot of those projects could be done as large scale revenue financed P3s. And so you would bring in some private capital into that because those typically involve about 30% equity investment from the P3 company and its partners. And then you have the new revenue source of tolling for the 1/3 of all vehicle miles of travel come on the interstates. So if they were converted to tolling, you would have the most important part of our highway infrastructure would then not be dependent on the gas tax and the Federal Highway Trust Fund. So that would be a good starting point, I think, that would get us moving in the right direction to deal with the crisis that I think I see is coming.
It seems to have worked to some degree with airports, certainly with on colleges and universities, with dorms, residential facilities. Who else would like to jump in on the future of P3s as a driver of projects? It's also hard to compete with municipal bonds with a 4%
It
or
is.
5% with a 4 or 5% coupon, where an equity investor wants a 20 or 30 or even higher percent return.
But we do have private activity bond, taxes on private activity bonds
Yep.
that are somewhat competitive with the municipal bonds. And TIFIA loans are low interest and they're a lower priority than bonds. So those are two helpful things that have been used in almost all the Highway P3 projects.
Right, and TIFIA bonds are federal, competitively priced
loans.
federal loans. Leslie, you want to follow that up?
I just wanted to give some examples. If the federal, competitive grants, the discretionary grants are going away first, as we see this, at SEPTA, they were critical, particularly in large projects like vehicle procurement. So I think that's where transit agencies will really have to figure out innovative, funding. And we're talking about billions of dollars for a system like SEPTA. And then you're looking at a 10-year horizon, like timeline, even to get those, the designs in place and everything. And then the other projects that we used were ADA accessibility. Like, so for some of our legacy systems, putting money into your operations that you need for daily, you're always caught in that cycle. But you want to bring up, your system that was built before cars were around, before ADA legislation was in place. And so to find the money to then go back and fix those systems, which is the right thing to do. Accessibility is a huge issue, obviously, for transit agencies and transportation in general. But to find that money, is very hard. So I just wanted to give some of those examples, and then turn it back to Baye, who also had mentioned, if we're looking at general fund transfers, right, for transit, if that's where we have to look, as well as we're trying to figure out whether it's P3s and whether it's other avenues toward financial resources, it just adds to the uncertainty. And it is just so hard to plan on an annual basis. And it's not even an annual basis. By the time the money's coming, you probably have less than a year, right? And we're already talking about those states who weren't able to allocate the funding over a 4-year period. And it's not because they didn't want to do so. So anyway, there's, a lot of questions out there. But Babe, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to make a similar comment to Bill on P3s that, it's hard to compete with the tax exempt muni market, and that ends up being really the most affordable option for a lot of states and local governments. We have seen some increase in the P3 availability payment model, but that doesn't really alleviate the funding pressures for states and local governments. So that's not necessarily a new source of infrastructure investment. It's just outsourcing some of the planning and construction responsibilities. It's reducing some of the construction risks for the states and local governments, but they still end up with a long-term commitment to pay the contractor. And we have seen some success in other areas, like MTA did a P3 for an accessibility project for its elevators. So more kind of discrete projects that are a particular type of technical skill that's maybe outside the core wheelhouse of the issuer. I think those are areas where we have real opportunities, but again, that's more of a project delivery opportunity rather than a funding opportunity.
I'm curious, before we get off this topic, Baye, Bob, if anyone else who wants to chime in, where do you think that leaves us with incentives for, multi-jurisdictional projects, right, across states? I know we've talked about, a gateway. If the federal funding is totally turned around, right, how do we get those multi-state projects?
I don't have a rough and ready answer to that. They're always tough. I mean, you typically have to have a multi-state compact legally approved. But I think the federal government has to approve those, and it takes a lot of negotiation to get them.
Yeah.
And
Maybe the flexibility you mentioned that we would need, right, for tolling, we would need flexibility on, a few other things as well.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the multi-jurisdictional projects are maybe an area where the federal government is still interested in participating. We have seen recent approvals of some of the, multi-state, or not multi-state, but dual state bridge projects, and those are moving forward. And I think that those are areas where it is often difficult for two separate states to come up with the kind of administrative and funding agreement. And we've seen it a number of examples. And it's kind of those extra federal dollars or the extra federal guidance that kind of carries it over the line to get it done. And those seem like the types of projects that would have national importance and have more federal interest.
Yeah, agreed.
I'm going to ask a kind of a shift gears question about two future trends that one seems to be going pretty fast. One seems to be not going pretty fast. The related questions from a couple of our listeners. One is a national framework for autonomous vehicles, and what this means that they're probably going to be electric autonomous vehicles, so they're not going to generate gas taxes, but they're certainly here and coming pretty strong. The other, which is kind of related, is the slowdown in the push for electric vehicle charging stations around the country. That was one of the centerpieces of Biden legislation, and the Trump administration doesn't like them at all. So put those together as future trends. Who wants to take the first pass on that?
I can start on some of these. So on autonomous vehicles, I think it's important for us to, remember, like, this is moving forward. So some kind of framework is on the national level is going to be helpful, focused on, like people have been saying, safety and transparency. But self-certification probably isn't part of that, although I know that's something that's been under discussion. But it's important to remember that autonomous vehicles are still taking up road space, and the technology isn't really there for multi-person vehicles like buses and so forth. I do think there's work that's ongoing, but it's important to note that this doesn't help congestion, which is a key issue in most of our regions. And then there's employment issues as well, depending on, who's unionized, who's driving taxis, who's doing trucking and so forth. So, I do think there's a place for a national threshold, but I think it's important to keep these things in mind. On EVs, I think there's a lot of tools in the toolbox, and I don't think that demand is, maybe it slows down a little bit, but I think demand is going to continue, especially in the current economic environment with, oil prices increasing. And I think states and localities are, getting smarter and more creative in terms of working with other entities in their areas, whether that's, arenas, parking vendors, other vendors to, the city or the county or whatever the municipality is, and providing grant opportunities at state and local levels, and also planning, incentive, zoning, and so forth, that you can build into your codes. So I don't think that's going away. Maybe there's less, federal dollars and incentives. I see that one cycling back around.
I had a friend, Owen Ritzberg, on the line. Knows her as well. She's a former member of Congress. Went back to the private sector, and was attempting to help some municipalities in her former district build EV charging stations with IIJA funding, and she gave up. She said there were so many strings attached, especially regarding equity and prevailing wage and labor requirements, that it was just too complicated for a small government to get involved with. Is that another disincentive besides the administration's somewhat hostile approach toward this?
I mean, I could add that there still is quite a bit of support in Congress, particularly from Senate Democrats, to continue support for these programs that, you're exactly right, have been really challenging and taken a long time to implement. I know the Buy America issue that was requiring, domestic parts that aren't made here yet really slowed things down as well. But I know Senate Democrats are committed, particularly on the Environment and Public Works Committee, to continuing support for these programs. So that's going to have to be a debate that they settle if they want to get a bill out of the Senate. I would also flag on the EV front, since we were talking about the dwindling highway trust fund, that there will likely be another push for electric vehicles to pay an annual registration fee that goes into the highway trust fund, which could be a way to get a little bit more equity across all drivers of vehicles, to make sure that everyone's paying into the system for its maintenance and upkeep, but just figuring out what that right number is for EVs is still up for debate.
Yeah, and before we get to the next question, and I don't want to speak on it because I haven't been involved in a while, but I do know particularly Pennsylvania put so much time into their NEVI plan. And I know that that was in question for a while, but I believe they are going through, going forward, right, for those states that really, want to see that continue. So, we'll see how that pans out as well. For our next question, we wanted to talk a bit about the impact of job cuts on the federal level. So a question that has been submitted from our participants today. It zeroes in on FHWA, which says with FHWA and US DOT in flux, losing a little over 4,000 staff positions, where do we anticipate seeing, leadership shifts? And is the US losing its edge to global markets with these cuts? If you want to comment as well, I do know, with NHTSA and FMCSA, I mean, those cuts are even more dramatic than what we saw at FHWA. But who would like to comment on that question first?
Yeah, I can share a couple thoughts. We have heard anecdotally concerns, particularly around environmental reviews being adversely impacted by folks no longer working in district offices or regional offices. But I would also flag these waves of retirement were also a concern, stretching back years, that there was going to be this generational shift that would have to occur at agencies with a lot of people reaching retirement age. So the kind of flip side, or the optimistic side, that we're hoping for too, is that it's an opportunity to embrace new technologies that might make some of these processes go more quickly, that might not have previously been adopted. So things like digital construction, handling more of the permitting process, cloud, things like that, could be opportunities as they try to weather this wave of retirements.
Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour. How about a quick jump ball, 10-second answer around the room? What keeps you up at night? What's your number one issue that you're working on? Why don't we start with Bob's laughing a little bit. So
okay,
we'll start with you.
I worry about tolling, which I think is crucial for the future, being unpopular and hard to implement in places where it hasn't been already there. It works very well in Florida, where I live, but it's hard to introduce in other places, and I think we're going to need it. It's a more reliable future revenue source than what fuel taxes are going to be.
Okay, tolling. Baye, what's your big 3 o'clock in the morning worry?
Sure. I mean, this is maybe as much a personal concern as a Moody's concern, but that the complexity and confusion and the funding uncertainty is going to lead to increases in deferred maintenance, which is going to be hard to measure and calculate, and is going to become a drag on states and local governments that catches them by surprise at some point.
darn right. I encourage you to go to the Volcker Alliance website and look at our work on deferred maintenance, the trillion dollar question. We have a new paper out, just came out in the fall. Lauren, what's your one big issue?
I guess mine would be that the Congress is so set on the Highway Trust Fund being fully paid for by user fees, but that Congress has no issue spending millions and billions of dollars on everything else, adding to the deficit, but for some reason we're singled out.
So we've noticed. Naomi.
Well, Bob's got me worried about Social Security, but this is a transportation panel, so I try to stay focused. I really think that Baye hit it in terms of the reliability of federal funds, regardless of how much the federal funds are used in proportion to your state and local money. Like having a steady stream is really important. Like Leslie said, discretionary is part of that, but then that also feeds into some of the challenges that we have with reduced staffing at the federal level.
Okay. And Eryn, last word from the counties.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what keeps you up at night? Counties cover a lot of things, but for transportation specific, I think it's somewhat similar to what all the panelists said, but especially Lauren in terms of priorities for Congress and what's really going to happen with the surface transportation package. There are a lot of competing priorities. Reconciliation 2.0 has come up. If we're going to meet this deadline of the end of September in terms of what's passed and what are the implications, not just for counties, but states and other levels of government too.
With that, I think we have to head for the exit. That's it for this edition of Special Briefing. Thanks so much to Leslie Richards, to our panelists and our wonderful audience, and special thanks to our production team, Megan Schmigdal, Amy Montgomery, Wesley Garrett, Alexa Halim, Noah Ritzenberg, Natalia Trujillo, and Divine Adeni. And thanks to the Travelers Institute, of course, the Volcker Alliance, and members of the Penn IUR Advisory Board for your very generous support. We'll be back on Friday, April 17th with an all-star special briefing on the economy and state and local budgets. Nothing going on that front. Mark Zandi will be with us from Moody's Analytics, along with Rochester, Minnesota Mayor Kim Norton and other experts. And so until then, I'm Bill Glaskell on behalf of Leslie Richards and the special briefing team, and we'll see you again in April.